step in the process of making the head is to make a wax model from which we will make a mold, and from there we will make our permanent clay pressing. But now we start with a wax image, and we have to make an image. So this is the kind of wax we use. This is a middle grade modeling casting wax for jewelers and sculptors and one thing and another. It's not too hard, it's not too soft, a lot of beeswax in it. And from that we make a generic face model. Now these generic faces are made from a mold. I made a head that was generic. Then we made a mold of the head. And then into that mold we pour wax to get this generic model. Now this is the foundation upon which we will build our new face. But this has to be attached to a plate. We use an aluminum, we're going to eventually show an aluminum mold, a die setup of aluminum, and this is the plate that goes in the middle of it that holds the model. And we're going to fasten this by heating the aluminum plate so it will adhere to the wax. And that's done again with a torch. And we heat it just slightly. We're not going to take it red hot. Just going to get it a little bit warm. Now we've established the wax prototype face onto the aluminum plate, and we're going to do all our modeling on this plate. And here are the modeling tools that I use generally. These are the hand tool, and some of them look like dental tools, and I suppose they might have been. Others are not, and they are for the purpose of modeling. Very fine file riffle, almost. But the essential tool is the waxer. This is an electric heating unit with an electric needle, and that's what's used to do the real modeling in this type of work. It heats up and liquefies the wax, and then you place the wax on your model, build it up or cut it down with the needle, and do finishing work with the tools. Over here is a basin which will contain extra wax if needed. You dip into this if you want to get some extra wax and bring it over to your work site. Well, first of all, we need images from which to work, and we've chosen the portrait of this young man. He's about 17 or 18, and we have a good profile and we have a good full face. We're going to try to transfer that likeness onto our prototypical wax beginning model. Now here is the model with a lot of the work already done on it. We've been working on this, and so you see the difference between the original prototypical eye and the new eye that will look like the young man in the photograph. And the mouth is beginning to look like the young man in the photograph as well as the nose. It's important to understand the profile so we can read that as being similar to the photograph. But we're getting there. Wax work, or modeling, takes days. It isn't done in a few minutes, but it's a matter of adding and subtracting wax to that prototype face that we started out with. You're constantly going back and forth between the basin of the wax with the stylus, the electric needle, and adding a little bit all the time, just a touch. He has a heavy eye fold, so that has to be placed where it should be. Here we have our finished wax face mask. Here it is in profile. You can see if it looks like the photograph or anything like approximate. It takes days to produce a good wax portrait. Nothing happens in a hurry. You do not do this in one day's sitting. So now we're ready to make a mold over this wax. One very important thing, before we make a mold on a model, we have to eliminate any undercuts. Those have to be filled. And I use plasticine to fill the undercuts, especially such as the nostril openings. Any little unevennesses that we're producing here, we should be able to correct when we finally get a pressing of the head later on in clay. But right now, we want to eliminate the worst of the undercuts. These will pull free when the moist clay is removed from the plaster mold, but it'll also tear your sculpture, and you want to avoid that if you can. Now, except for the base around the nostril, which are undercut, we have most of the undercuts covered. It's always distressing to do this because you're losing a lot of your sculpture where it seems that you are. And believe me, it's worse if you don't do this. I think that's more or less got it. Now we're ready to set up our diking system. Here is the layout of the metal parts of the dike. It's all made of aluminum, and it's in sections that can be clamped together. These are stapled, riveted together pieces, all the same. There are 4 of these, the sides, the bottom plate, and the 2 plates that go in to make the section that the head is built on. So we'll start assembling. Very important that they all be resting absolutely flat on the plate, otherwise the plaster will leak out from underneath. Now these are simply to support the head plate and bring it further up in the mold. It's very important to put the head plate in carefully so you don't tip it and mash it. Now the head plate is in there with our model. I'm going to tip the whole thing so you can see it down in there. The sides are not cemented to the bottom plate, but all right. Now our dike setup is ready to pour plaster. Now we get the plaster ready. The thing we do is to paint with a brush the surface of the wax. You can't see me doing this, but it's very important to get all the plaster down as close to the wax as possible in all the little details. Otherwise you'll have bubbles around those and you'll have a bubble instead of an eyelid. So getting that painted on that wax is very important. That's the first thing I do. And scrubbing it around with this brush with semi-stiff bristles won't hurt the wax. Just make sure that all the bubbles, see those little bubbles? Get those out of there. Now we're going to pour the rest of the plaster in there. And once we've got it full, I press down on the mold and I'm going to vibrate it by tapping it, pushing it down onto the plate so that my vibrations don't lift it. So anyway, everything seems to be in order. A few bubbles will rise to the top, that's all right. And now we let it set. It'll take about a half an hour. Well, here is the mold that we have produced for this skull. We made the mold on our wax model. Now the mold needs to be corrected. These corrections are very slight. We want to make sure there are no undercuts where the clay, when we press it in, will be caught and pull away. We've corrected the nostrils, done a little work around the eyes, and actually carving in the mold with the proper tools is what I do. I go down and I emphasize some of the lines. For instance, the eyes, around the edge of the eyes, the eyelids, sometimes a little bit in the mouth, around the rim of the mouth, there's a bit of a ridge, and you want to make sure that that's there. Make sure the nostrils are free of any undercuts. All of those has to be remodeled. Maybe we gave a hint of eyebrow by making small lines. People ask how the eyebrows are made. Well, sometimes you start here with making small indentations in the plaster itself, and that produces a hair-like model in your eventual pressing. And want to make sure that the rim of the mold is free of any edge that would catch. So we go around that with a blade of some sort and cut that down, or cut it away if it's there. Cutting in the plaster is easy enough to do. The trouble is you don't want to overdo it. You want to make sure you cut just enough and not too much, because if you cut too much, of course, you'll ruin your mold. And of course, to test it with the skull has to fit down in there so that and you have to do this by eye. You want to make sure that the eyes in the mold are coming up close into the eye sockets that we have in the skull. So you just have to look through and see if it's coming close. You want to make sure that the chin is resting on or close to the chin inside the plaster mold. And that's done by carving away parts of the skull so it'll settle down in there. The cheekbones of this model are not terribly wide, so the skull bone had to be carved down here some on both sides. You see the cuts? And the teeth got in the way a little bit of the mouth form, so they had to be cut down slightly. That's not hard to do. You don't care about preserving your skull. That's simply a basis on which you mount the whole thing so that you don't lose the proportion of the head. If you didn't have a skull in there, your head might be all kinds of shapes and proportion that you don't want. Now, in order to just make a preliminary check, this is plasticine. You want it to be very flexible. I usually, you see me moving it in my hand to warm it up, so it'll be soft. And we're going to put this, it's temporary, over the face. Press it down. Put a little bit of talcum powder in the mold as a release. I'm going to take this over and knock the excess out. Now we're ready just to make a test pressing. You notice I put a black mark here and here. When that black mark at that end meets that black mark at that point, then you know that it's down into the mold where you want it. I have to obscure the effort with my hand here for a moment to press it down in there. Now are we down to where we want to be? Yes, we appear to be. It's a little bit off center. There it is. This side isn't quite down. There it is. Now that's as much as we're going to do. We don't want to get too excited over this part, but we want it to come out again, so we're going to wiggle it. Just wiggle it slightly. We hope it'll come out. If it doesn't, but that's not the end of the world either. There it is. Now what you see on the lip is just talcum powder. Now in order to test how deep we need to go or how deep we've gone, we simply put one of our tools into the clay and see how far it goes in. That's not too bad on a cheek. It's a lip. going into the teeth. You see, we're stopped by the teeth. The chin, that's all right. That's all right. The brow doesn't have a lot of flesh on it, but it's maybe a little deeper than we want, but that's all right. We think we're going to get away with our full clay pressing now. We made a test with a plasticine. Get all this plasticine off our skull. I want the skull to be clean. And look and see if there are any bruises on the skull that would indicate that it's too close. Now it hasn't pushed through the plasticine anywhere, so we're probably ready to go. Now the next step, we're going to clean out the mold for a moment with a brush. And then we're going to put a little more talc in it. It's very important that we do this talcum powder because we need the release. The clay we're going to put in is water-based and it will stick to this hard plaster mold if something isn't between the clay and the mold, especially when we're pushing it in. I'm going to take this off the screen while I push to take care of the excess. Now there's our mold with the powder in place. Now the next thing is, what do we do with the clay itself? Here is our paper clay. I'm taking the moisture off the surface with a paper napkin. We want this paper clay not to be sticky, soft, but solid, not dry, just solid. It's almost the solidity of the plasticine, a little more flexible than the plasticine, but about the same. And here is our cement or glue. It's just an all-purpose white glue. And we're going to put some of that on the face of the skull, just the face. All we're working on is a face mask. We're not doing the whole head, just the face. But we want to get the cement on evenly all over it. Certainly you get some under the chin. You could use a brush, but that's not really critical. Now just the face has glue on it. Now we're going to put some clay on that face. And you notice I'm maintaining a kind of point. This point has to go down into the nose of the mold, so it has to really be there to begin with. Otherwise it won't press down into the nose space. Now I generally put the clay into the mold, not onto the face first. But to do that you need to have a little talcum powder on your knuckle to push it down. You don't want to pull it out again. Now we're going to put this is the critical part, we have to get this in there so that we can make certain it goes all the way down. And at this point we're going to have to use a vise. So we're going to sandwich the very important plaster mold with the head almost down in it and a backing pad that won't break the plaster, made of wood with a pad on it. And now we're going to put it in the vise. Well, here we have our setup in the vise. This is a big heavy vise. Now we're going to close it slowly. You can see how already the clay is beginning to push out of the mold around the head. Maybe you can see more as I crank the vise down. I'm closing it slightly. Motion, not sharp, very soft. Now I'm going to turn the setup by releasing it slightly in the vise so that we do this evenly. Hope for is even. See how it's pushing out of the... See it come out? Alright, we don't want to overdo this now, or we crush both the head and the mold. Let's just check and see where our marks are. Oh, they're very close. Now we're going to release our setup from the vise and take it back to the workbench. And now here's the setup as we took it out of the vise. It's back on the workbench. We take off the pad and we remove the metal plate. Now it's just the skull squashed into the mold with the clay between. I move some of that clay up around the skull so that it'll be out of our area of work. And to begin starting, we hope this will come out well, but if it does, wonderful. If it doesn't, we can do it over. But we want to get started with moving the clay around the skull, filling in around the jaw, the neck, This is just, most of it's temporary. And on the inside, but the clay is pushing up through the eye sockets. We want to scoop out some of that. We also want to push down in the eye sockets, so I have this round end plug to use. It's the shape of the eye socket. We can push it down into the eye socket. That's pushing the clay against the mold. That's all that's doing. We're not squashing it hard, just pushing it down a little bit. Now we're going to try to ease the whole thing out of the mold. This is probably the trickiest part of the whole process. We're going to put this sharp implement in and begin moving it just a little bit, pushing down on top as we do it. We don't want it to pop out, tear all over everything. You can ease it slightly, see how that eases, if it does. There, it's beginning to lift. You can tell you can see when the skull is coming out, but the clay is staying fixed in the place. A lever, yeah, the skull is... Well, now we've got our pressing. Nothing is ever perfect, but those things that you might see as imperfections can be corrected, especially when the clay is still soft. We're going to remove our mold from the work area and begin moving some of this rolled up clay back on the skull. We have a long way to go here. This is just the beginning. It's very important that you don't overwork this phase of the press mold process. You can only do a few things to the head at this point, in my opinion, before you can go forward with the rest of it. Now, one of the things is that the chin of the subject is not hanging down, so you can begin to move that up a little bit under the jaw. Remember that this clay is easily carved or cut, and it's easy to add to it more clay. It does not resist that. Now we need to open up the nostrils a little bit. All of this can be tweaked and improved upon as time goes by. We have to come around under the edge of the nostril. That's the too bad part about a press mold. You can't have undercuts and you lose some of your details. But these can be re-entered. And a little bit around the mouth. We have to be very careful of this. Otherwise you change the expression. Ideally you should be working from your photographs as you do this. The corner of the mouth is always tricky. People don't really understand that structure too well. In my opinion, many sculptors don't. Now, because the subject had a fairly heavy eye fold, young as he was, the eyelid, the upper eyelid is lost under it, but there's still a difference between the eyelid and the eye fold. So a little bit of work on that helps. These eyes, the eyeballs that you see here, are all clay. These will all be ground out as the process progresses. But you don't want to go too far at this point. Just give yourself a hint of what you're going to come to later. The plaster skull is right under the edge of this clay here, so we can't go in too far. Now this crazy cracking that you see is just the clay separating in the mold. We can fill all that very easily. We're not going to fuss with it now. That'll happen when the clay is dry, the head is dry, and we go to the next step. We'll dress that up. Just going to make a little more smoothing along the jawline here. usually wet my tools in water as I'm doing this. The moisture is fine as long as you're not disturbing the structure. You don't want to make it mushy all over the place and then try to play with it, because then you'll spoil your structure. It's about as far as we want to go at this point before we let it dry. So I say this is the beginning stage. There are lots of places to balance and lots of places to carve away and to fill. But there we've got the basic form of the face. The face is now pretty well complete, and it's minus ears and eyes and hair. So these are the next steps. And the first thing we're going to do is to hollow out from the back here the eye socket so that we can set in the eyes. Step one on that is to go around the edge of the eye with a sharp tool and start cutting in from the front. Our grinding is going to be done from the back, so we're blind. We don't know where we're going to go. We hope we're not going to go through the face. And this is just an effort to get a little head start on the grinder. And if things break, eyelids or something crumble, this isn't the end of the world. These can be repaired when the eyeball is in place. Just hoping to cut through the thick barrier of clay that's inside. You know, we've already ground well into the skull, and there are holes down into the eye sockets from the back, but there are still several millimeters of clay between this surface and this surface. Oh, there, good, we've cut through on this one. This one's ready to grind out from the back. See the hole, the eye hole. Now we're going to work on this one a little more. Apparently there's more clay behind this eye. Cleaning this material out of here a little bit before we start with the grinder. We want to see the grinder coming forward as we grind. And the only way we can see it is to have some rough opening here in the front. And now that'll give us enough room. The steel burr, this is the grinder. We're going to put this through the back of the head and into the eye socket until it comes forward, reducing the material at the back. Sometimes it pushes the handles out of them, and they tend to collapse a little, but that can be repaired later. It's one eye, now we're going to go with the other one. See the grinder pushing this thing around. Not bad. I'm going to use the scalpel to clean that out a little bit. We don't want to torture this thing too much until we get the eyeball in there. Then we can tease the eyelids and make adjustments at that time. Now that eye looks pretty good. This one's a little less successful, but it will all work out. Now before we actually put the eyeball in there and cement it in place, we need to finish any little detailing we're going to do on the surface of the face, this area, and then we'll address the ears. But the first thing is we want to make sure we have all our details where we want them, except for the around the eye, the mouth and the nose. Make sure that we've cleaned up what we can. Remember, we lost all our undercuts when we pushed the clay into the press mold. Now we want to restore those, the nostrils, the lip line. I notice our model has a slightly off-balance mouth. Nice mouth, but it's a little bit longer on one side than on the other. You don't want to emphasize that or it'll look peculiar, but if you don't give it some character like that, then it won't look like him at all. Make sure the cheek is balanced on either side. The back of the head and the back of the neck are not our problem at this time. That comes later, after we've put the ears on. We always want to keep referring to our pictures, the messages of that photograph of that young man. Sometimes we need a tiny bit of clay to add on to what's already there. So we keep handy a small amount of clay. And we keep our glue bottle handy too, just in case we want to add something. I'm going to put just a touch of clay on the septum of the nose because it has a slight rounding there that didn't come out in the press mold. We want to be careful as we work now from the rest of the head that we don't smear that. Now the next thing we're going to do before we actually set in the eyes is to put on the ears. But that means we have to grind a little area for the ear to set in. The ear is set behind or above the jaw and above the cheekbone.
We're going to grind a little space in that area. A little pan, as it were.
The ear is generally on the height of the ear is at the top of the brow, so we're going to try to line it up that way. You all have a skull in your studio. You see this is the area where the ear goes, and here's the brow. The top of the ear will be here, and here's the cheekbone. So this goes in here, whereas that comes out again, and this comes out. Now because I use a press mold, here they are, for the ears, modeling a set of ears each time may be a great art, and you want to do it that way, but ears generally have a similar contour, and if they have extremely different qualities from the average ear, you can model those on later, but I use a press mold. And it's very important at this point that the clay you use for the press mold is not sticky. I've emphasized this with the face itself. When you put this face into the clay for this face into the press mold, if it sticks in the mold, it makes a mess and you have to start over again. So the same is true with the press mold for the ears. And here's a little bit of talcum powder we use to brush into each ear press mold. And you don't need much clay for this. You're just going to put a tiny ball in there and press it down into the... See how nicely it popped right out? That's good. If it didn't pop out that way, that means it would be too sticky. Any excess we'll cut off. There's the other ear. Press it firmly down into the mold. See if it wants to release easily. I think it will. Now we need a very small amount of adhesive glue here on the side. And make sure you pick up the right side of the mold to put on the face, otherwise the ears are opposite. You don't want that. And you press it down firmly against the head. With any luck at all, it will release. Now you may want to adjust the position of the ear, and that's alright. Just make sure you put the mold back on where the ear, it fits it, and move it slightly. Don't worry about the excess for the moment. Now let's try the other ear. A bit of glue. Now they're just put temporarily there till we make sure and certain that they are the same distance back and the same height on the face. Our right ear looks if it could be adjusted slightly down. I have to look at it straight on. The camera will not see it straight on as easily as I can. Now we're going to cut away or move away the excess material squeezed out around the mold. Now we're going to use a brush and a bit of water. Nice thing about this clay is that it's a water-based clay. Very easy for smoothing and finishing. You can't do this with polymers. I think we have a fair pair of ears now. And when these dry, we'll be ready to set in the eyes. Before we actually put in the eyes, we're going to put a scalp line on this face so that when we put hair on it, this will be ready. So now we have drawn a line. Now we're going to cut around that, on that line. I learned this technique from the American Indians. When they scalped people, they had to only cut down to the bone. They didn't have to cut any deeper to peel off the scalp. This scalp is only 1 millimeter thick, so we have to make sure maybe 1.5 millimeters. Doesn't go any deeper than that. Of course we can't because we have this bone skull underneath the clay, don't we? So it's a moot question. It'll all work out. The thing I don't want to do is to cut into the ears. Alright, now we're going to gently excise a layer of material out between our cuts. Now we don't need to take it all the way off the skull completely, but we do need to taper it down to those cut lines. So we don't take it off here, but we do take it off millimeter deep here, or anywhere near the cut line. Cut it. Finish this off and you can start again. Now all we're doing is removing material, trying to make it even. This little tool has tiny teeth, like a sculptor's chisel. And you can see the mark it makes. See that little claw teeth on this, like a sculptor's chisel? It's a great tool for removing small amounts of material when you're very tight space. All I'm doing is working on the area where the hair-covered scalp will be glued on. It isn't totally balanced. That's not the end of the world either, but I'll just make it balanced. You can't come down too low on the forehead with your scalp. Well, you don't want to come over the eyes, but any lower than this, because you can pluck the hair away from the edge of the scalp, make a hairline whatever you want, but you can't add the hair. Once it's on, the hair is going to be only so deep, and that's it. And you do not want to make your join here at the hairline itself. It's hard to cover the hairline that way. You'll see when we put the hair on. So I think we're ready now for the next step. Well, now here is our head almost totally ready for the eyeballs. And here are the eyeballs. They are blown glass. Originally I purchased my eyes from Japan, but now I'm purchasing them from England. A man named Mr. Hand, and this will be in your list of available materials resource list. These are solid glass, not hollow, and I asked him to make the irises with a dome. He's still working on that, but there's a corneal pouch. It sticks out away from the eye. Conical, it's a little too radical, but it's a roundish bulge on the front of the eyeball, which needs to be perfected, but these are what I have now. And I hold them with this little wooden dowel with a hole in it, so we can see if they fit into the back of the eye. And where they don't, then we grind away material so they will. I see a little difficulty with that eye and a little bit with this one, so we will get our grinding tools. I'm going to grind out a little more in the back of the eye here. Just trying to free up the space in there so that the rod and the eyeball, when it's inserted, don't push up against things and get deflected. Now let's see if our eye has a little more leeway in it. I think we've done enough grinding. Let's see how the eyeball fits. Well, it's a little wide, but we'll fill in what's necessary. See how the other one does. That looks pretty good. So now the next trick is, how do we get them to stay in there? So we take a little bit of our clay. Now this clay can be a stickier version of the ear clay. It doesn't have to be so dry, but we need just enough to make a little round edge around the eyeball of clay, and then we take our cement and we run a little bit of, I'm going to run it on the back of the head here so I have something to work from, and use a tool to distribute it inside around the eye socket. You can't see this, but you can imagine what it's doing. Just behind this area. A little bit of glue, and we're going to place our stick with our eye on it. Down there, you see how the glue is pushing away from the front of the eye there. Brush, we'll just brush that away a little bit. There's a lot more to be done than just this. But now we have to release it from the post. This requires a second tool to push the eyeball down while we pull the post out. It isn't exactly where we want it, but we're going to get both eyes in there, and then we'll worry about focus. A little bit more clay, another eyeball in the end of the tube there. I think this time, so you can see better, I'm going to put the glue right on this little round of clay here. Put it down in the eyeball, on the eye socket. Take our tool, push it out. I'm pushing on the stalk. You saw the stalk that went into the wooden holder. I'm pushing on that stalk just to push it forward. The other end of the wooden thing is a little flat piece, and we're going to push our clay down into the eye socket around the eyeball. Theoretically, we're holding it there. Takes a little doing to get it all distributed. But eventually, the materials we're working with give up and go and do what you want them to do. You just have to torment them until they do it. Perseverance is the key to everything here. Not patience, perseverance. You can be patient with your cat or your dog, but you're not patient with this. Now let's see what happens. Well, we have a not totally awful focus, but it does need to be worked on. Now in order to focus the eyes, you just barely touch the stalk. And you see the move? See the iris move? I'm pushing it forward a little bit so that it doesn't want to sit back in the head. It's arguing with me at the moment, but we'll get him. Another way to adjust the thing is to, of course, look inside the back and see what the stalks are doing. They should be lined up too. It's impossible to show on the screen unless we have some sort of a micro camera. Take my word for it. I'm also using the brush end to push the clay more evenly around the eyeball in the eye socket. Not a lot of finish work we can do until that clay around the eyeball hardens and dries. And that's dry, then we can come around and tailor the eyelids. But we do want to have our focus pretty well established. You can't move it easily once the clay is firmed up and hardened. I'm pushing the lower eyelid against the eyeball slightly. I don't know if you can see that, but the eyelid is very thin and moves easily. I don't know if the focus is perfect or not. We can maybe adjust it a little bit. It looks fairly even. Well, now that we have a good start on the ears being planted and the eyes being put in, the eyes are not finished, we have some detailing to do, but they're in. Now we want to close up the back of the skull. So this is a simple matter. Here's the piece we cut off, here's the clay, and here is the glue. We're just going to put a little bit of glue around the edge of the and put the cap on. And while it's still getting settled, we're going to put a bit of clay around the edge just to model it into conformity with the rest of the head. This will be covered with hair. You will not see any of these seams, but still in all, you don't want it to be too rough. And any roughness you see at this stage, when it's dry, we can sand or grind away the rough edges. Now that is virtually all there is to that. As soon as that dries out, you can go ahead with the next step, which is doing some detailing around the eyes to finish them off completely, and then prepare to put the hair on. There are two areas of hair we're concerned with. One is the head hair and the other is the beard. Sometimes characters have beards. And that's the end of that process.